Right, so everyone has fallen into a polite hush, and since we are going to get kicked out quite promptly, I'm told, at 12, we best get on with it. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for braving the wet weather to be here for what promises to be a really fascinating panel discussion. We've got some great expert speakers. My name is Aveek Bhattacharya. I am a research director at the Social Market Foundation. For those of you who don't know us, we're a cross-party think tank that works across a broad range of policy areas, but kind of economic transition is certainly something that we are absolutely fascinated by. And it's a real pleasure to have this discussion on the growth mission and what contributing to it looks like for different actors in the economy. Not just businesses, but also broader communities, universities, civil society, broadly construed. Really pleased to be partnering with UCL Policy Lab, who are working together on this event. Couple of notes of housekeeping. If you are on Twitter X, we are at SMF Think Tank, at UCL Policy Lab, and hashtag LPC24. There aren't any fire drills planned, so if fire alarm goes, follow the green signs. You may be able to note the camera there, so do be aware that this is being broadcast live to the internet, so anything stupid you say will let an note both to panelists and audience contributors. So without further ado, I'll work through the panelists and have an opening contribution, looking at different kind of aspects of the growth mission and kind of how we can contribute to it. And ask a few questions of panelists, and I'll open up. So you've got probably a good half an hour and 40 minutes to think up your sharpest and most difficult questions. So I will start with Dr. Lukasz, who is lecturer in economics at University College London, broad kind of expertise in macroeconomics, and so a great person to kick us off on this economic question.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Aveek, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. And thank you so much for coming. So let me kick off by outlining sort of the growth challenge facing the country. So since the global financial crisis, UK growth has been very weak. In fact, it has been so much weaker than before the crisis that if it had followed the trend up to 2007, the real income of everybody in this room and everybody in the country would be 26% higher. So this is a massive gap that has opened up. But perhaps this number overstates the size of the gap since the Brexit vote and the ongoing kind of issues around policy uncertainty and the uncertain environment that's not very conducive to investment. And so the same group of economists have also been asked, what can we do about that going forward? What should be the right? Is a process of change, is a process of finding new and better ways of achieving the same goal, and therefore the environment that's conducive to growth is an environment that's conducive to change. Change also comes through, in economics we call it creative destruction. So in order to do things in a new way, you have to kind of stop doing it in the old way. Right, so some of the less efficient or less productive businesses will need to go out of business, so that the factors of production can be used in a more productive way. And I think allowing this sort of environment of change and dynamism is another thing that we should maybe discuss more in the panel in terms of both how to allow it, but also how to manage the fallout and the consequences. Because with every dynamic change, with every change like that, there's going to be consequences that will need to be managed. And I think, I want to close with, how to actually, in the step in the direction of how to actually try to do this in practice. And I want to make three points here. So first is we need to create right incentives, and I think there's plenty of scope to do that for example, through the reform of the tax system, so that it incentivizes people to work more and work more productively. Second, I think that we need to reduce the barriers that have been created by Brexit to the maximum extent possible, given the political environment. And third, and I think very importantly, we need to have a sense of there needs to be a sense of optimism in the economy. And I want to underline this point because I think it's often forgotten that the importance of optimism comes across even in the most basic macroeconomics textbook model. If I'm going to invest for the future, I need to expect that this investment will yield a sufficient return for me to make that investment, basically. So in a standard, neoclassical growth model, if I expect TFP to be higher in the future, so if I expect the economy to be doing well, I'm going to invest more today. There's more elaborate theories on that. There's this sort of Keynesian trap theories and so on. But I think the main message that this optimism is important is there in even in the textbook model. And I think there's reasons to be optimistic. The gap is now so big in terms of productivity and in terms of the gap to the other countries that it's relatively should be easy to find ways to grow again. I think a lot of the mistakes or drivers that I've mentioned are also policy choices that we have made in the past. To the extent that they could be reversed, they could be changed going forward. And the UK has got great comparative advantage in many sectors, including ICT-focused or the focused sectors or universities that could be built on to stand up to that challenge.
Right. Thanks, Lukasz. Right, and now I'm going to look to my right and Mathu Jeyaloganathan, who is Chief Investment Officer at the Community Wealth Fund at London Borough of Camden. And prior to that, has worked across social entrepreneurship and social finance in a range of private sector roles.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me here today. Before I get into the Wealth Fund, I wanted to give you a bit of a background on Camden. So Camden is a borough that's about 22 square kilometres in North London. It's responsible for about 2% of national GDP and has about 360,000 jobs within that borough. It's quickly become a hub for life sciences with the Francis Crick Institute, AstraZeneca and Merck all headquartered in Camden, as well as ICT and generative AI with Google, Meta, and also the Alan Turing Institute next door. But like a lot of places in the country, Camden is highly unequal. 2 in 5 children in Camden live in relative poverty. And if you think about life expectancy between some of the poorest boroughs in Camden and some of the richest, women in the poorest boroughs are expected to live 10 years less and men 14 years less than in some of the richest boroughs. And the reason I'm giving you that background is because when we talk about Labour's mission for growth, sustained economic growth, we also need to talk about the distribution of that growth. When Labour talks about being an active, smarter government that works in partnership with business, we need to talk about an active, smarter government that also works in partnership with local authorities, citizens, and academic institutions. And in Camden, we've been doing that for a couple of years now. So in 2019, we held the country's first Citizens' Assembly on the climate, where we brought together over 200 conversations in the borough about what the climate challenge means to the residents of Camden. We also have been doing work with citizens' assemblies and local citizens on a key part of our GDP, which is our evening and nighttime strategy and how that really affects growth in Camden. And we've even brought together a small number of people to talk about how to govern data within the borough of Camden and what does a locally developed data charter look like. In 2023, we took that step further. Camden Cabinet committed £30 million to the creation of a wealth fund. I came on in March 2024 with the Wealth Fund's mission to do 3 main things. One is to become an anchor institution to drive growth within the borough of Camden. 2 is to have that growth be governed by our mission-oriented approach to government, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about over the last day. But in Camden, we have 4 missions around food security, youth, economic opportunity, diversity and inclusion, and our estates being a creative and vibrant place to be. And if you think about all of that, the last critical thing that the Wealth Fund needs to do is have a heavy citizen participation approach to its decision-making and its resource allocation. This year, we're embarking on a pilot where we're bringing together hopefully hundreds and thousands of businesses and citizens to develop and create an investment strategy around our diversity mission, and then actually make the investment decisions as to where that money goes in the borough to stimulate the growth that we're looking for. And the reason I say citizens is because when we think about the Borough of Camden and its unique capabilities, we have to recognize that there's large corporates involved in this conversation. There's some leading academic institutions involved in this conversation. And so when we start to make those investment decisions, coming together, bringing those people together, is ultimately, we believe, going to result in a much better investment strategy and growth for the Borough of Camden. Just to bring it back to why this matters, the stats that I repeated at the beginning of my little spiel, it's not unique to Camden. That inequality exists all across the country. And we really think that there's a place and a voice for national government with the British Business Bank, the Wealth Fund, and the UK Infrastructure Bank to devolve some of those resources and power into local and regional authorities who really understand where that growth needs to be within their areas.
Great, thanks, Mathu. And we're going to stay on the kind of sub-national theme. I'm going to turn now to Mayor Dan Norris, who's Metro Mayor for the West of England and MP for North East Somerset and Hanham.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. It's good to see you all. Hope you're having a good conference. I beat Jacob Rees-Mogg, which I felt was a public service, to be honest. And I have to say it was fantastic to get Loxit done. So think about it. Okay. Look, I need to tell you a little bit because I presume I'm going to talk mainly about my regional responsibilities as mayor. Let me tell you a little bit about my area. It's about 1 million population. It includes Bristol and Bath as the main cities. Interesting in that Bath is a World Heritage City, has particular challenges because of that, as well as the advantages that tourism brings. Bristol, well, people will know Bristol, but in fact, Bristol has more Georgian houses than Bath, would you believe? People often don't realise. It's the birthplace of a number of people you will know. Those who are older amongst you might know Cary Grant, who's a Bristolian, arguably the most famous Hollywood star there ever has been. J.K. Rowling was born in South Gloucestershire in the north of my region. I actually went to school with J.K. Rowling. Mary Berry was born in Bath, the bake-off person, the baker. I didn't go to school with her, in case you were wondering. And Banksy, of course, I may have gone to school with him. I don't know. Who knows? Look, what I think it's a really important question that you've asked about how all these various organisations, business, universities, communities, and government can work together. But actually, there's a missing bit there. Trade unionists need to be involved in that, I have to say, because if we're going to have genuine and successful growth, it has to be done on the basis of everybody who has a major part to play, being involved in that discussion, being involved in that success. I agree with the speaker before about we need to ask what happens to the prosperity, where does it go? Because one of the things I think is very exciting about all of these things like AI and quantum computing and all the rest of it is going to totally revolutionise the future in a way that makes the creation of the internet look like nothing. It's going to be vast and huge. But the big question is who benefits from that? When the wealth is created, where does it go? How is it then distributed? That is a question I still think the Labour Party and the Labour government has to work really hard on, because wealth creation, just for the sake of it, isn't enough. It's got to be about transforming society in the way, as I, as a socialist, believe is important. I suppose the other thing that I would say is it is about collaboration, but it's also about letting people get on and do what they already do well and not slowing them up in that process. Now, that's not to say there are not areas of growth where we could be stronger. Without question, that's true. And that's where I think government comes in a key way, because government sets the relationship for that working together, where you liberate some people to get on because they're doing it ever so well. In my region, for example, it is quantum computing. We're about to build very shortly the world's first quantum computers, all theory now. Lots of programming comes from Bath University. Bristol University is a centre of excellence for quantum computing, along with Israel, the USA, China, and America, of course. And just out of interest, you might want to know that the reason China's so good is an awful lot of Chinese students came to Bristol and learnt about it, and maybe that was an error. But there's a whole lot of things. The aerospace industry in my region is vast. It's the biggest aerospace hub outside of the USA. We have all sorts of incredibly interesting things like composite materials, which are lighter and stronger, which will transform in the future at some point how aircraft work and operate to the advantage of the environment, unlike now. So there's a whole lot of things that need to happen. But unless government sets out that framework for all the groupings that you've mentioned, plus trade unions and no doubt others, to be able to carry on being good at what they are good at, but also encouraged to be better where they need to be stronger, because it's a competitive world without question. And the other thing I'd say about my region is it's very, very progressive when it comes to the environment, amazingly progressive. And that's an area I think that has got great potential for the UK, because I think green jobs are good jobs, they're well-paid jobs, they're interesting jobs, that's something that we should be working for anyway. But actually they have the potential to create huge wealth for our country, because lots of the skills that we're already good at are transferable in that area, which is good. And what I think we need to do as a country and as a Labour government is use our history. Not all of our history in the past, of course, is good, but we should use our historic connections of having an empire which obviously was dubious in many ways, but we moved away from, thank goodness, our commonwealth that exists, and our modern connections, and above all, our fantastic language, which is the greatest advantage of all, is the language of science and so many other things. We need to use all that history and connection, because we can be moral leaders in the world when it comes to the environment and dealing with the climate emergency, in my view. And that's because when you look at the history of CO2 emissions ever, the UK, which makes up 0.05% of the world's Earth's surface, when I was an environment minister back in the last Labour government, we, in the history of all time, have been the second biggest contributor of CO2 emissions to the planet. So that tiny area had that huge impact. Now, we didn't know it was going to cause the problems it did, but if we're going to be credible in creating wealth and opportunity in that space, we've got to be really careful what we tell the rest of the world. So when they want to have their industrial revolutions and they want to feed their very poor people, we better have our house in order. Otherwise, we're just not going to be listened to. And we could be a really good thought leadership in that space, which I think is part of this as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And last, certainly not least, I'm going to turn to Yuan, who is MP for Earley and Woodley, and has been thinking about writing about economic issues across journal stints at The Economist, the FT, and has written a very good book about economic transition in a quite different context in China as well, which you all should read.
Thank you, Aveek, for that introduction. So I am the newly elected Labour MP for Earley and Woodley, which is in Reading, along the M4 corridor, which goes all the way to Dan Norris. Like Dan, I also unseated quite an old school Tory. So mine was John Redwood, who very much comes...
Another public service.
very much, I think, was quite absent from the communities and that form our area. And I think that's one of the big challenges we now have as newly elected MPs, is to show communities what a present MP who's actually in the community and listening to local voices can do. And I think that's the big challenge for all of our new intake, to really make our imprint in the area. I'd like to speak a little bit about my constituency from that community-oriented lens, but also to tie that frame with what I did before I was an MP, which is I was a journalist at the FT and at The Economist for most of my career. Before that, when I had just graduated from the LSE with my graduate studies in economics, I set up a campaigning charity called Rethinking Economics, which was aiming to challenge and extend and expand the ways in which economics is taught in universities and discussed beyond universities. And that's part of a sense coming from my generation, a generation that went to university during the financial crisis, that graduated into the austerity era that Lukasz has just mentioned. That was really formed by that political experience, and also all the unraveling crises of our economy, of our society, of the environment that were unfolding in the early 2010s. And hoping that economics could rise to the challenge as a profession and as a discipline to engage with those real life crises. So I'll throw a little bit of that angle into my remarks today. I really agree with what Dan said in terms of wealth creation not being enough, and Mathu's remarks about looking at distribution of growth. And I think when we talk about growth, we have to ask what kind of growth are we looking for? There's been a lot of growth in the UK in Western globalized economies over the last 3 decades that has not benefited large portions of people in left behind communities, and that poses an economic challenge and a political challenge and a social challenge for the fabric of our societies. So I'd like to kind of use the framework of the foundational economy or the everyday economy, which is a term used by a group of researchers primarily based at the University of Manchester, among whom is Carol Williams, who may also be possibly better known as a former co-author with Rachel Reeves on papers relating to this concept of what is the everyday economy, what is the economy that people not in the economics classroom, but in our high streets and in our towns and villages and cities actually live in, and how do they experience the economy? And their notion of foundational livability rests on these 3 pillars. Firstly, of course, there's the income aspect in which people exchange income for market goods, but that's just one of 3 areas that are essential for a good life and for a livable community. The second is, of course, essential services, health, education, which generally are only providable by the state. But thirdly, I think this is where the community aspect comes in, it's social infrastructure. Now that could be the parks, the libraries, the community associations, the cafes where you bump into people and you meet people and you make connections. And by and large, I think in the history of kind of classical economics, there's not been so much written about the social infrastructure elements. But in fact, I think this has come into vogue a lot more in the last few years, with a lot more writing on social capital by the likes of Andy Haldane, the former Bank of England chief economist, and the way in which social infrastructure and social capital relationships of trust fill in the gaps in our society and in our economy in ways that are very difficult to substitute. And I think coming through the austerity era, coming through the pandemic, the breakdowns of many of the market and essential services elements of those 2 pillars has exposed ways in which the kind of social fabric has had to absorb a lot of capacity that would otherwise be provided by the market or by essential services. For those of you who have caring responsibilities, I think for many of the women in this room, this is a very natural concept. If there is not the paid carer supplied either on the market or by the council services, somebody in the household has to do it. And by and large, a lot of the time it is women who do that kind of invisible work, again, filling in the gaps and gluing things together. And that's also, I think, partly to explain for the retreat of many women from the job market during the pandemic. And of course, that goes into the discussion over labour supply that Lukasz just mentioned. In my community in Earley and Woodley in Reading, it is local community organisations that try to fill in that gap. And I want to give an example from the Woodley Community Development Association, which is one of the local funded community associations. A woman called Claire in her 50s who had a lot of mental health problems during the pandemic, but didn't feel that sense of trust that she would need to engage with NHS mental health services, ended up making some very long-standing friends at that cafe, who eventually referred her and started to introduce her back into the kind of essential services NHS component of mental health rehabilitation. And now is getting support, is now thinking about return to the workplace. And that's just one example of the many kinds of people who've been supported by local community groups. Again, supplying the necessary interventions and essentially the trust that otherwise would be missing from the market or from the kind of essential services, quite individualistic way in which services are often delivered in many welfare states. Another example, John, a man in his 60s who lost his job again during the pandemic, but has a great sense of pride and didn't want to feel like he was somebody who was on benefits. There's a lot of benefit stigma in many communities, including in Reading. Instead would go to the food bank that's run at the cafe, would volunteer at the food bank and thus feel like he was being empowered not just to receive support, but also to deliver support to other people, and made a regular kind of routine of volunteering there, kind of expanded his support network, his friendship groups, and again now is actually back in work after the pandemic. So those are 2 examples I want to just give as kind of case studies to give a really kind of visual idea of what kinds of things community organisations can do and how they interact with both the essential services and the kind of market side of our economy. And to make the overall argument that in many places, in many cases, particularly after the pandemic, especially after 14 years of austerity, Many of the market institutions of employment are not working for the kinds of people who've been left behind. Many of our essential services, unfortunately, have crumbled after the last 14 years of asset stripping and cost cutting. And so in this particular environment of crisis, it's really local community organisations that rise to the challenge. But even beyond these, the past 14 years, even as the Labour government comes in and makes change in the market in essential services, it is also community organisations that will hold the power to maintain the trust and the engagement with the government's agenda. And I think that's particularly important in areas where you can see steep inequality. I think in every borough, probably every constituency of the UK, you can see that as well. But in my own in Reading, there's also the phenomenon of some of the UK's tech giants, like the UK headquarters of some of the global tech giants like Oracle and Microsoft, being headquartered in business parks in my constituency, only a few streets away from areas where there's been very low employment, very low actually secondary school and beyond secondary school educational attainment. And I think this comes down, to the themes that previous speakers have talked about, which I'll finish on, which is the idea of power and empowerment in the community. Community businesses or community-run businesses are not only a way of delivering growth, but also a way of showing how local people in often quite behind communities, how it's possible to achieve transformation on their high streets in their own very lives. And I think that's it's not a kind of coincidence that 48% of community businesses operate in the 30% most disadvantaged areas in England. I think it's not a coincidence that community businesses also generate and keep wealth much more in the local area. And I think that's not just about distribution in terms of flows of income. It's also about being able to see transformation in your own lifetime, in your locality. And I think that is the most important part of what we can deliver as a Labour government, delivering the growth, delivering the improvements in foundational livability, but also showing people that such transformation can happen, particularly after the last 14 years of decay.
Thanks, Jan. So I'll abuse Chair's prerogative and ask a couple of questions of the panel before opening up to the audience. And I just want to pick up on kind of one of the themes of your contribution, Yuan, there, which was starting to pick a little bit at GDP and what we measure in the economy. I think it's been quite interesting to see when Keir Starmer was first elected Labour leader, he flirted a bit with kind of post-materialist kind of other measures. There was talk of a healthy life index or well-being approaches to the economy. And that seems to have kind of hardened towards a more conventional position whereby by the time we came to the emissions, it was to have the fastest growth in the G7 by standard GDP metrics. So I'd be curious to get people's thoughts as to what is the relationship between GDP and some of these other goods that might not be measured in terms of our national income. Is it the case that if we have more money or more kind of economic resources, then we can fund these things better? Or is there a risk that we end up prioritizing the wrong things and these things get squeezed out, as Yuan was saying, led to the start of rethink economics? Yuan, do you want to come in on that to start?
Yeah, I know this is an old debate in economics about GDP as a measure. And it's important for many things. It's important when we talk about debt, when we talk about investment, returns on investment and profit and so on. So there are many measures by which it is important, but it's not the only measure that you can steer the ship with. And I think we do need to think about many other measures of livability and of well-being in the economy, and also of ecological and environmental metrics as well, which aren't captured in market transactions. And so I think those are the kind of, I would say, the kind of, if you like, a set of indicators that you're trying to understand where you're going. You need to look at all those indicators when you're steering the ship as well. I think one thing I want to bring to this discussion is a lot of our GDP measures, so GDP per capita is measured on an individual basis. A lot of our economic metrics are kind of divide by the population and average across the whole population. And there's obviously a big issue with that kind of average level approach. And I think that averaging out doesn't work at the individual community level. Again, there are many communities in the UK where extremely prosperous areas are right next door to extremely deprived areas. And when you think about the, let's say, kind of modal average experience of what it's like to live in a city or in a town, in a borough, that's not really captured in any way by the kind of mean average of income. But I think also the household level or the family level is something that's often missed out of these discussions. And we do have we've inherited a welfare and tax system from the Conservative government, which has a lot of regressive features, particularly for single parent families, and particularly for particularly because there's always the assumption of two earners in a family supporting a family of say 1 or 2 children. So I think looking at the household level and looking at the street level is a really important way to go.
Mathu, I'm quite conscious that Camden has taken a wellbeing approach more broadly. Do you have concerns about the relatively narrow kind of mission or target that the government set itself, or do you have any learnings from what you've done in Camden as we try and scale that up nationally?
Yeah, I think when we talk about a mission-led government, there are quite a few things that we can fall into as traps, right? One of it is being a top-down approach to mission-led government. And when we think about mission-led government, we also, in Camden, talk about, like Yuan said, what is that bottom-up approach? How do we bring community organizations into it? And I think one of the advantages of working in a mission-oriented way is looking at that gray space, right? That approach that we take through missions is there to bridge the gap between some of the tech giants that are in both our boroughs and in Somerset, which is one of the most deprived estates in the country, which is right next to the Google headquarters in Camden. And so it's through working with government and partnerships that I think you can look at how that distribution of growth works. So Lukasz talked a little bit about skills gaps and capacity of labor. So in Camden, we're working across 60 different organizations in the life sciences and academic institutions to provide what we call the Camden STEAM partnership, to provide the individuals in those estates and in those wards that are the most deprived access to the mentoring and the apprenticeships and the jobs that come from living in a borough with all these amazing partners and institutions. And so that is an approach where local government is working with the bottom-up government to really coordinate the different functions and advantages of a borough. And so when we
Disrupting growth is our headline measure, and the risks and trade-offs there.
Yeah, so let me pick on that and then come back to the question of distribution, which is obviously first order. So GDP per capita is not a good measure of welfare, and it's never been intended as a measure of welfare. However, it is extremely well correlated with all the other stuff that you care about, both in terms of over time and in terms of across countries. So it so happens that richer countries are, have better measures of subjective well-being, they have better health outcomes, and they can deal with some of these, lower end of the distribution issues, i.e. poverty and deprivation, in a better way. So I fall somewhere in between. I'm very sympathetic to developing the new measures, and a lot of work in the academia has done this. And I've got, as you said, my own research is really about highlighting where these boundaries of measured income are. But ultimately, if you have more income, you can also allow yourself more freedom, and you have more resources to tackle some of these deeper issues that are not measured by the income. And we should always sort of bear that in mind. But certainly, I'm not like here as an economist, as a staunch kind of defender of GDP concept itself. Now, there's been this fantastic discussion about distributional issues, and I just want to highlight and underscore how important that is, because it's obviously important from equity and social fairness point of view, but the distributional issues are also first order in terms of actually thinking about growth itself, in terms of thinking about aggregate numbers. And the reason for that is exactly as Dan said, that in order to generate growth, I think at this point, where the economy as a whole is kind of at capacity, OBR or the Bank of England, if you read their publications, they say the output gap, right? So the measure of free slack in the economy is close to zero. So the way to generate growth is to bring in some basically new resources into the table. How do we bring the new resources to the table? Well, we exactly look at these areas that were left behind, and the people who are not currently part of this process of contributing to the market economy in the extent that they could, right? And so policy that deals with this inequitable outcomes has got a first order effect on the aggregate outcomes, okay, on the aggregate growth. So I think distribution policy is growth policy, okay, to a large extent, and we should think about that through this lens. However, it is also true that in some cases there will be trade-offs between aggregates and distributions, and in some cases not. So, you know, where there are no trade-offs, there's no trade-offs when it comes to investing in areas which lack capital, or investing in people that have not enough skills, or they have been left behind. You know, a bad economic model is one where everybody who's left behind can go to the bank and get a £500,000 loan and educate themselves to the required level, right? This is a model without credit constraints, a model that in academia has been abandoned, you know, or if it's ever been really alive. So, you know, that is a bad economic thinking. Good economic thinking is that these people, a lot of people who are left behind just don't have the means to catch up by themselves, and therefore that requires you know, some policy. And so investing in these areas, investing in these people will deal with the distributional issues and generate growth. There's no trade-off. But there are other policies where there is trade-off. Okay, so for example, when you think about housing, going back to what Dan was saying, you know, you could build houses where the issues of affordability are most pressing, or you could prioritize building houses in the areas where there's highest productivity. So where do you want people to move, right? If you think about growth, then the more growth enhancing, you know, house building would be, you know, in the areas that are already productive. We're going to generate more of these are cities, right? We're going to generate more agglomeration effects. There's going to be more growth coming out of that. But perhaps there's some areas that are not productive and still don't have affordable housing for the sake of affordability itself, and perhaps, you know, creating that quality of life. You want to build houses there. Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other. What I'm saying is that it is useful to have a framing where you can lay out this trade-off and then make a conscious decision. And perhaps, you know, that decision is perhaps rightly going to be to build houses in the areas that have very low affordability metrics now, but at least we know that out of that house building, we're not going to expect like a massive productivity boom, and that's fine. But we should have an honest conversation about that. And just one last thing, because I've been talking too much, but I just want to say that again, these issues about essential services and social infrastructure and income are super tightly interconnected in both directions. Okay, if we manage to raise growth to the fastest rate of G7, that's going to be, you know, extra 0.5 percentage point per year over the next 5 years. We're going to have way more resources to fund on the margin the essential resources and social infrastructure. At the same time, it goes the other way too. We are now seeing the fruits of not investing in essential resources and infrastructure through the dire growth outcome. Okay, so the three components, they all need to sort of go together because they really complement each other. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. You've all been very patient. I'm sure you have lots of questions, so now I'm going to open up to the audience to put your hands up. Lady here.
Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Bray and I'm from the Charity Save Foundation. We know that social fabric and wellbeing is really sustained by charities and voluntary organisations, and it was really great to hear the panellists talk about community organisations. But there is a challenge that those places that have higher levels of deprivation also have fewer community organisations and charities and weaker capacity as well among local people to give. So from our perspective, we really see this as a call to encourage a culture of giving and be really strategic about getting that money where it's needed. But I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts about ways that the government can work with philanthropists, givers, charities and community organisations to strengthen that social fabric.
I'll take a couple more as well. Gentleman here.
I'm Fabian Postelvene from UCL and IFS. So I'd like to go back to macroeconomics for a little bit. When I think about theories of what determines total factor productivity, I think of things like investment in human capital, innovation, maybe to a lesser extent, public spending and public investment in public infrastructure. Those are things that need to be sustained over the very long run, and that will have effects that will make themselves felt over a horizon that's way beyond that of the current parliament. And so the government can't expect very kind of early political dividends from, even if it does these things completely right. And we can see the effects of that happening now in the US Biden administration. So my question is, how to navigate that, how to sort of, keep the momentum going beyond the horizon of this government or this parliament, and how to make people trust that this will actually happen, because expectations drive everything.
I heard Labour's going to win 5 terms, so maybe it's lady here.
Thank you very much. I'm Mathu. I work at Bristol Nice Web, a pharmaceutical company. So my question was, innovation obviously is a key part when it comes to economic growth and driving that. And there's a lot of debate about the triple helix model for innovation, so between industry, government, and academia. But local community organisations don't really feature as part of that conversation. So to Matthew's point about bridging the gap, that grey space, my question is, how can we reshape this helix and try and get local community organisations more involved in that discussion and in those collaborations? And then from that, what can business do? Like, what is the role that industry and big business can play in that? What would you want from us, essentially?
Can I take maybe that political question and the bridging the gap? You asked earlier about like what the metric is. I think there is an economic metric, but there is also a trust metric that needs to be measured at the same time as we think about this growth mission. Like the number one thing that will allow us to keep working on this mission is how much people feel and individuals feel that they are a part of this government and working with this government instead of just government being something that is done to them. And so if you look at some of the work that is coming out of Taiwan around political participation and online digital citizens assemblies, we need to figure out a way to get individuals to feel like they are part of the process. And that's why this participation approach to investment, to government is, I think, one of the small ways that you can start to think about creating something for a 50-year horizon, a 100-year horizon, not just a 5-year term.
Yeah. Well, look, I was thinking about some really good questions there. I think in terms of social fabric, I think there's a great opportunity with the way high streets are changing. I think we should be really ambitious about that. I think, what is it that we need in our high streets? Whether that is, more space for meeting, whether that's bringing health into a different space, away from hospitals, whatever it is. I mean, that's a really important thing with cohesion. When it comes to sort of how we help individuals, well, look, I said how important that is, that everyone can contribute. That is true. But we also have some fundamental questions to ask and answer before then. We are pretty unique in our population aged over 55 during the pandemic. Loads of them dropped out of work and are still not back there. And that's, I understand, other people know better no doubt than me, but I understand that is fairly unique to us in Europe. I think we need to be asking how those people with lots of experience, a lot of knowledge, good patterns of working and being able to work, having spent a lifetime doing it, are not contributing to our economy in the way that we would reasonably expect. I think that's a very important question to ask as well. And that's something only a government can kind of really lead on, but we need to get them back. We also need to think, I think, in more flexible ways. So I think childcare, elder care, which is predominantly obviously a burden on women. Hopefully we'll get equality, that will change, but where we are now, that's not so. I think we need to be making childcare and elder care part of infrastructure and define it in a different way so that we can liberate predominantly women who end up doing those important jobs and responsibilities so they can be part of the economy too. I try and do initiatives in Bristol where we are trying to attract women to be bus drivers, because actually getting around my city and my region is really difficult. Congestion costs the economy there £500 million a year. If we could unlock that and get people in the right place at the right time, freely and straightforwardly and affordably, that would make a big difference to growth in our area. But women are not being part of that solution. They should be, because it's traditionally been a very male business. We're actually having some success, you might be interested to know, amongst students. So lots of students are in the hospitality business, as you know, working part-time to support their studies and things. But actually, many of them are now going into being bus drivers. which we're very keen to encourage, because my problem isn't money to pay for buses, it's actually there aren't enough drivers. You know, there literally aren't people to drive the buses. If I can have 200 drivers, that would liberate huge amounts of growth, because people would be getting around, and as well as all their social lives would be enhanced as well, and getting to healthcare. So there's lots of things I think we've just got to look at in a slightly different way, which I think would be quite important. And then, you know, my job as mayor is really about trying to horizon scan when it comes to skills, but it's hard because a baby born today will have about 7 careers in their lifetime, and 4 of those haven't been invented yet. I mean, it's just the rate of change. Whereas when I was born, you know, you had 1 or 2 careers on average. So we're not going to be able to see you way into 30, 40 years' time, but I think there are pretty good indicators of where things are heading in the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions. So one on time horizons and how do you kind of embed change rather than just being driven by electoral cycles, and then a couple about supporting charity organisations and community organisations for innovation.
Sure. I mean, on the point of long-run investments, I think this question comes up a lot and came up for me when I was a journalist for the FT and based in Beijing, because there's always a tendency to compare democratic systems in the West and the authoritarian governments of China and its kind of 5-year plans and 50-year plans and so on. And I think that's in some ways a false comparison, but I do want to tie this discussion back to the discussion around consensus and community. I'm very humbled by the fact that there are many community groups in my constituency that have been running for decades. They know their communities very, very well on an extremely kind of micro-local level. They will be there long after this parliamentary term and the next parliamentary term and the one after that. And I think I see my role as an MP as supporting the leadership that already exists in my community and trying to make sure that that's sustainable, both financially in terms of funding and helping them fundraise where possible and stay on a kind of long-term sustainable footing, but also making sure that I can learn from their kind of long-term experience in working with communities as well. And I think that's particularly important when you counteract the change in the 5-year parliamentary term. I think also any society, including a Chinese society, British society, in the long run will have to have, for there to be really sticky consensus about what a good society is, what good governance is, and the building of consensus over time. And I think this is an area in which authoritarian societies tend to do very badly at. So, for example, some of the most long-term policies implemented by the Chinese government, such as the population control policy and the one-child policy, were reversed literally overnight by a decision of the Politburo or of a few, essentially kind of 5 people in a room at the top of the government, and then enforced in a top-down way for the whole society. Society is not moved with the government when it comes to views on what size of family to have, where to bring up their children. Those kinds of social discussions have not been allowed to happen or even generated at a very grassroots level. And so I think that's part of the reason why the Chinese government's, for example, population policies have come in such an out-of-touch way. Now, in the UK, we have the benefit of democracy and protection of speech and protection of assembly. And that means that we can have roots, as Mathu described, and have citizens' assemblies to build that consensus in a long-term way. And what I'd really like to see in this government is the creation of I think we've obviously won the political consensus in an overwhelming way at the election, but to build that into a long-term sense of accepted political norms in the UK, that doctors and nurses and teachers should be paid a salary that retains them, means that they don't have to use food banks, that we shouldn't have food banks in a flourishing 21st century rich economy, that we should be paying the amount, we should be funding our services to the amount that we can actually support people on the essentials, and that we should be paying for it through a fair and progressive rather than regressive tax and benefit system. I think all of these points of argument about how we can shape a long-term political consensus need to be built from the bottom up, including in election campaigns. Obviously, we need to win those campaigns, and we need to win them in a way that can build long-term wins in terms of accepting that this is the common ground of what it is to live in the UK.
I'm going to try and sneak in a couple more questions. Sorry, Lukasz. Lady there.
I'm Anne Lane. I run the commercialisation company for UCL, which commercialises research. And I know in the Labour manifesto it talked about supporting university spin-outs. How does the panel think the government can support innovation, encouraging innovation of university research?
And the gentleman next to you also had questions.
Yeah, employment is a great way of distributing wealth in our sort of demand-led Keynesian economy. But generative AI, as Dan and Mathu can say, may well eliminate some of those jobs, especially entry-level jobs. In what way is generative AI a pessimistic view of eliminating jobs, or an optimistic view of giving people who don't have the skills the ability to then take on opportunities to do jobs that otherwise you have to teach them how to do?
Right. Lukasz, I'll go to you. We have 3 minutes to quick answers.
Okay.
So solve AI. And
pick up on that one. So it's obviously too early to tell what the incidence of AI will be with any certainty, and also how fast or dramatic these changes are going to be. But the risks are obviously there. I think the early research suggests that AI has been affecting different parts of the worker distribution than the previous waves of automation. So obviously we've already went through dramatic changes in robotization of the labor market, or parts of it, particularly manufacturing, and there has been some parts of the labor force that have been much more affected than others. And this is mostly low to middle skilled manufacturing jobs. And I think the early research shows that AI is hitting more towards the upper end of, not the top of the distribution, but more the north of the median. But it's early days. So there's indications perhaps that it will be very good for people, just as you said, just entering the labor market, getting assistance with some of the reskilling or obtaining new skills. For me, kind of the important question is also like how productive these new technologies are going to be, and if they are highly productive, then we should have the means to then make good the people who are on the losing side of that trade. But of course, that's easier said than done, and the political process is kind of much more complicated than this. But I think part of the problem with the previous automation technologies is some of them have been kind of so-so technologies where the productivity boost is actually not that large. And then there's really a lot of the fallout in terms of people losing their jobs, but not much resources to then make up for this fallout.
Great question. Dan, any thoughts on specs?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we need is space for incubation. We're brilliant at creating ideas, translating them into products and wealth creation we're not so good at. That's the gap we've got to close as a government. I think there's some lovely figures that in the United States, you need about 1 million square feet in a city in order to meet that need. We're certainly a long way from that. Certainly in Bristol we are. There's some exciting things happening in some parts of the UK, but it needs to happen more. And the government should invest very strongly in that, because I think that would just unleash amazing potential, amazing opportunity, and amazing wealth creation. So I think that would be really good. And then in terms of the political consensus that was talked about, Labour won the general election really well with a landslide. And I was actually able to be in the last landslide because I was elected first in 1997. And it's a very interesting comparison. I still think Labour's got to build trust. I think we won, just 35% of those who voted, but that's not a big proportion of the whole population. We've got a job of work, and we must not forget that, because the danger is you get seduced when you're in power to thinking, this is it, and everybody backs you and what have you. And actually that'd be very dangerous for us. And as we're seeing with the attacks on Labour at the moment, and since we've been elected, there's a very strong and well-resourced right wing out there that so we've got to do our job as well. So in order to help you, we've got to not forget our place and the trust building we still have to do, because people are very cynical about politicians, sadly.
I'm afraid we are just at time. So all that remains for me to say is to say thank you for coming. Thank you for your participation and great questions. Thank you to our fabulous panel for really thoughtful and insightful contributions. Thank you to UCL Policy Lab for partnering with us on this event. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Do come along to some of our other events, and hopefully see you around. Thank you.